Welcome back, focus learners, to another explainer. Right off the bat, I want you to think about the last time you wished your city had better public transit. Maybe it was during a frustrating, gridlocked commute, or maybe you were just wondering why a desperately needed train line was never built, simply because the city said, well, there just aren't enough riders yet. Today, we're unpacking a text that completely flips our mental model of how public transit and infrastructure should be built. We're exploring the architecture of inevitable mobility, which draws on the regional operational framework of Indian railways. And honestly, this isn't just about trains. It's a profound blueprint about space, human behavior, and the fundamental way we build the world around us. So get ready to rethink the physical landscape you live in. Okay, let's dive into this. The source material drops this stark, uncompromising claim right out of the gate. There is a fundamental lie in how we design transport today. If you've ever waited hours for a bus that barely comes, or felt literally forced to buy a car just to participate in modern society, you've lived this lie. We've all been conditioned to believe that public transport is a business that has to justify its own bottom line. We just assume a town or a neighborhood has to mathematically prove it has enough paying commuters to somehow earn a train station. But this text, it argues that this entire premise is profoundly flawed right from the ground up.
So let's look at Section 1, the fundamental transport lie. We really need to look closely at this deeply flawed concept of demand in modern infrastructure. On one hand, we have the old way, right? We build railways as if people must first prove demand before they deserve movement. We're treating mobility like a conditional reward. I mean, imagine if a city required you to mathematically prove you were thirsty before they laid down municipal water pipes. That sounds absolutely absurd. But that's exactly how we currently treat trains. If a society waits for demand before building access, that society is structurally trapped. The new way, however, treats mobility as an absolute foundation of civilization. It's an undeniable starting point, much like having air to breathe or water to drink.
Which brings us to the radical pivot in Section 2, a new operational truth. This alternative reality proposed within the framework of Indian railways operates on a concept that completely upends the traditional urban planning playbook. They call it a new operational truth. And the quote is just brilliant. Mobility is not a response to population behavior. Mobility is what creates population behavior. Let that sink in for a second. We usually think people move to a suburb and then the city builds a train line to accommodate them. This text says, no way. You build a train line, and the sheer presence of that line literally dictates and creates the economy and the settlement. This isn't just about transport optimization. It's a civilizational redesign principle. Moving on to Section 3, the structural base unit.
So how do you actually build a system that ignores demand? How do you operationalize this philosophy? Well, you have to start with a concrete foundation, what the text calls the structural base unit. The framework anchors on a highly specific number, 50,000. Think about what a population of 50,000 represents. It's roughly the size of a robust town or a vibrant city neighborhood. In this new architectural framework, a block of 50,000 people is not just a dot on a map. It is a rail node by absolute right of existence. Its right to be connected to the broader world doesn't need to be debated in some long, drawn-out city council meeting. It is an inherent, unalienable infrastructural right.
And let's break down exactly what these units are inherently owed, because these are uncompromising rights. Every single 50,000-person unit gets one primary railway station, and they get guaranteed hourly train connectivity to adjacent units. And notice that crucial final point, no demand justification. There is zero negotiation here. There's no waiting around for feasibility delay or some multi-year environmental impact study on ridership metrics. If the 50,000 people exist, the station and the hourly train must exist. But it drills down even further to the number 10,000 to ensure that absolutely no interior space is forgotten. Inside that larger 50,000 unit, every 10,000 population cluster automatically receives a stop. Why? Because a system that ignores these smaller clusters isn't just inefficient, it is incomplete. Just think about what geographical isolation actually feels like for a person living in a cluster of 10,000 people. If you don't have a car, you're entirely cut off from accessing better jobs, higher education, or specialized healthcare. Leaving them stranded is simply not an option here. The author defines leaving a gap between these units with some truly absolutist phrasing. They call it a missing piece of infrastructure reality. If two 50,000 population units aren't connected by rail, it's not merely a missed service opportunity, it is a literal tear in the fabric of the civilization they are trying to build. Because it's a gap in reality, it must be built immediately. Not later, not optionally, not when some algorithm magically declares it profitable. It must be built because reality itself is incomplete without it.
Let's shift gears and look at Section 4, Enforcing Infrastructure Reality.
Obviously, putting such a rigid, unapologetic system into place requires a very different type of management to strictly enforce it, which brings us to the core mechanism, the Hourly Passenger Train Service Unit. Imagine a transit boss whose job description literally doesn't care if they sell a single ticket or cut a single inefficient route. That would be completely absurd by modern standards, right? But here, their sole mandate is to enforce existence. They are a dedicated operational authority whose only job is to ensure that every hour, trains run in every direction, even when they are completely empty, even when they are dead quiet.
Now, running empty trains sounds like a massive waste of money to our modern economic ears, but the text provides its brilliant justification. The purpose, quite literally, is to train society itself. The goal of these empty trains isn't to passively follow where society currently wants to go. The trains act as a relentless ticking clock of opportunity. They are actively shaping and training the society of the future to rely on absolute certainty.
And that brings us to the final visionary outcome in Section 5, reversing development order.
When you install this kind of relentless, guaranteed connectivity, you implement a radical infrastructure layer that entirely reverses the order of development. Walk through this generational timeline of acceptance with me. At first, naturally, people will ignore it. In the first week, empty trains pass through silent stations. But as we move into the first year, a subtle psychological shift happens. People stop fearing distance. Imagine a young person realizing they can confidently take a great job 3 towns over without needing to take on debt to buy a car. They stop planning their lives around the scarcity of transport. By the first generation, the behavioral changes compound, and the systems completely transform before the economics even realize what's happening.
And this brilliantly illustrates the psychological effects of scarcity versus certainty. When you live in scarcity, small towns are isolated endpoints. There's a real claustrophobia to it. These are places you have to make a difficult, deliberate effort to reach or leave, which often traps economic potential. But when you live in certainty, those very same small towns transform. The claustrophobia lifts. They become dynamic nodes in a continuous corridor of life. Work, education, trade, relationships, they don't just suck inward toward a single congested megacity anymore. They organically spread outward across an entire region, because access is eternally guaranteed.
This brings us to a philosophical question from the source that completely flips our entire standard transit metric on its head. What kind of society emerges when trains exist regardless of passengers? We stop obsessing over how many passengers justify a train, and we start marveling at the kind of dynamic, interconnected world that blossoms simply because the trains are relentlessly present.
What we see is this beautiful cascading domino effect. Step 1, movement is guaranteed at the very foundation. Because of that, Step 2, the economy naturally follows the rails. And once that regional economy takes root, Step 3, lifestyle choices dramatically expand. People realize they can live further out without sacrificing opportunity, so Step 4, comfortable settlement follows. Ultimately, Step 5, an entirely new civilization follows. A stagnant geography literally wakes up and becomes a living, breathing system.
To summarize the ultimate logic of this text, we have to deeply understand what it calls the real inversion. We have to stop building infrastructure for the flawed, centralized, and scarcity-driven society we currently have. Instead, we must start building the infrastructure that creates the society we actually want to become. Hourly trains, every town, every hour, whether used or not. The infrastructure itself is the seed.
Once you accept that this level of connectivity is entirely possible, that it's really just a choice of resource allocation and political will, the ultimate question is no longer if we can do it. So we'll conclude this explainer with a final mic drop question directly from the source material. What kind of society are we refusing to become by refusing to build it? It's a question that demands we deeply rethink the spatial reality around us. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, focused learners. Keep questioning the structure of the world around you, and I'll see you next time.